This question appeared recently from a couple of viewers who both wanted to know how to take the results of an ADO record set and use those to populate a list box on a user form. So that's what we'll show you how to do in this video. Just to show you the basic example we'll create, I've got a pretty much empty workbook. There's no data stored in this file at all, but I've got a button that will display a user form, and as soon as that user form appears, it populates its list box with a set of data taken from a closed workbook. Just for convenience, I've saved that workbook in the same folder as the one which contains the user form, and I'll stick a link in the video description so that you can download these two files, so you'll have exactly the same data to work with. I'm not going to take things any further than that. I'm not going to explain what you can do with the list box afterwards, simply because we already have a fairly detailed video which describes all of that. And again, I'll pop a link in the video description so that you can visit that video if you want to take things any further. So I've gone back to a new blank workbook, and all I've done so far is saved it as a macro-enabled workbook in the same folder as the movies file that we'll connect to. To get started, I'm going to draw the basic form with a list box and then maybe add a button to the worksheet so that we can quickly open the form for testing. To do that, let's head into the Visual Basic Editor, and to insert a user form into the project, we can right-click in the Project Explorer, choose Insert User Form. I'm not going to spend any time making the form look in any way more attractive than it currently is. There are lots of properties you can change to improve its appearance, and we've got videos which describe how to do that, so I'll link to those at the end of this video. For now, I'm just going to increase the size of the form by clicking and dragging on the handle in the right-hand corner, and then I'll find my Listbox tool on the toolbox. If you can't find the toolbox, by the way, if it had been closed down previously, then you should be able to find the toolbox button sitting on the toolbar up here. And when you click on the toolbox, that will make that toolbar reappear. The Listbox tool is this one here. It says Listbox when you hover the mouse cursor over it. And to draw a Listbox, click on that tool and then click and drag on the background of the form to draw that item. I'll just move my toolbox out of the way and then just resize that list box a little bit. Again, there are lots of properties of the list box we could change in the properties window, but I'm going to keep everything as the default for now. The only thing you might consider changing for convenience is the name property, because that's how you reference the object in your code. But I'm going to stick with the generic listbox1 for this video. All I'd like to do now is create a really simple way to make this form appear when I click on a button on the worksheet. So to do that, I'm going to right-click into the project and choose to insert a module. And I'll create a quick subroutine in here called Show Form. And then I'm going to reference my userForm1 object, so I can press Ctrl and spacebar, reference userForm1, and then apply the show method to that. I can then head back to the worksheet, find my Insert tool on the Developer tab, find the Form Control button, and then draw one of those in some cells. Remember, you can hold down the Alt key if you want to get your button to snap exactly to the edges of cells while you draw it. And you can do the same thing when you resize it, as I'll explain in a moment. But I'm going to attach the Show Form macro that I've just written, click OK, just resize the button to make it snap to the edges of cells again, and then change the text on the button to say something like Show Form. Once I've done that, I can click away from the button, and then the next time I click on the button, it makes the form appear on screen, and I can close the form down so we can have hours of fun opening and closing your form. Next, we can start adding the code that will connect to the movies workbook. To do that, I'll head back to the Visual Basic Editor, and I'd like this code to be triggered whenever the user form is loaded or initialized. So to do that, I need to access the events of the form. There are a couple of ways of doing this, but I'm going to right-click on the user form object in the Project Explorer and choose View Code. Then to select the correct event, I need to use the drop-down lists at the top of the code window. First of all, from the top left-hand list, I can select my user form object, and that will provide me then with the default event for the user form, which happens to be when a user clicks on it. That's not quite the one that I want, so I'm going to go up to the top right-hand drop-down list now and choose the Initialize event instead. I can then get rid of the click event procedure entirely. Then I've got a new procedure into which I can write the code to connect to this movies workbook. We're going to use Microsoft ActiveX Data Objects to connect to that external workbook. So to make sure we get as much help as possible from the IntelliSense, let's first of all head up to the Tools menu and choose References. And then we can scroll through the list to find Microsoft ActiveX Data Objects, and then simply check the box next to the latest version we have available. So in my case, that's the 6.1 library. Having done that, we can click OK, And then the first variable that I'll declare will be called cn as adodb.connection. I'll then create a new instance of that class by saying set cn equals new adodb.connection. And then I'd like to set the most important property of the connection object, which is the connection string. So just for the moment, I'll make this equal to an empty string because I'm not going to write out the connection string from scratch. What I'm going to do is head over to connectionstrings.com, and I've already navigated to the correct page for the particular provider I'm going to use. So I've got my link for Excel 2013 XLSX files, and I'm going to copy the connection string there to the clipboard, head back to the Visual Basic Editor, and then paste in what I've just copied. It could do with some tidying up, so let's spend a little bit of time doing that. I'm just going to break this across multiple lines by using the space underscore continuation characters. And I'm going to break this every time I find a semicolon character, basically. That indicates the end of a particular property defined in the connection string. So the first thing is the provider. I'll close some double quotes after that first semicolon and then concatenate that with a space underscore continuation character. And then the next thing is the data source, and I'll find the semicolon character at the end of that. Stick in another set of double quotes and then concatenate that with a space underscore, and then take extended properties down to the next line, and that's the last break we're going to make. There is one additional semicolon character there, but that's contained within a combination of different properties which set the extended properties of the connection string. And that's actually why we've got the syntax error here as well, the line flagged up in red. The extended properties are contained within a set of double quotes, which are of course then themselves contained within a wider set of double quotes. So I've got to solve that problem either by doubling up my double quotes within the wider string, or alternatively, and what I think looks a little better, is to use single quotes instead. So I'll drop the single quotes in there, and that's the connection string syntax error solved. The final thing we need to do is make sure that we're pointing to the correct workbook. So I'm going to just type in a double quote after the equal sign there for the data source property, and then concatenate that with a reference to this workbook.path. So that's the folder, of course, that this workbook is saved in. And then concatenate that with another string, but not c:\my folder, my Excel file. It's going to be /movies.xlsx. So that's the reference to the Movies XLSX workbook in the same folder as this workbook. Finally, what we can do is test that this is going to work by attempting to open and then close the connection. So I can say cn.open and then cn.close a bit further down. And of course, we'll do some interesting things in between those two lines. To test that this is working, we could simply open up the user form, and if nothing goes wrong, if we don't see any error messages, that's a pretty good indicator that things are actually working. But it might also be nice to see something appear in our list box. So I'm going to say listbox1.AddItem and then simply type in connection opened or something like that, just to indicate that something has happened. And then if we switch back to Excel and click on the Show Form button, if our list box says connection opened, that's a pretty good sign we've reached that far in our code, so that part's working correctly. So we can close down the user form and then look at how we can now start getting data out of that connection. Let's create a record set variable to hold all the data we'll pull out of the external workbook. So we'll say dim rs as adodb.recordset. We can then create a new instance of the Recordset class after we've opened up our connection by saying set rs equals new adodb.recordset. There are a couple of properties of the Recordset we then want to set, so let's say rs.activeConnection first of all, and that will be equal to the only connection we have available, the one we've just opened. And then we'll also want to set the Recordset source, so rs.source equals. Now this is going to be a string of text again, and it's going to be equal to a SQL select statement, basically. And in order to write that select statement effectively, we need to know a little bit about the structure of the Movies workbook. So let's just open that up so we can see what's in there. And when it finally opens, we can hopefully see there's a single worksheet in there called Sheet 1 and many columns of data there. I'm not going to select every single column into the list box. I'd like to select just the title, the release date and the runtime columns. So it's quite important to know the names of those columns there: title, release date, runtime. So having just checked that out, let's close that one down and head back to the Visual Basic editor. The header row there, I should have mentioned this earlier on actually, in the extended properties, HDR equals yes indicates that the file we've connected to has a header row. And if it has a header row, that means we can use those column headers in our select statement for the record set source. So as a very basic, simple first example, let's say select, and then in some square brackets, the name of the first column, which is title, then a comma, and in some more square brackets, the name of the next column, which was release date, and then another comma, and in some more square brackets, the final column name I wanted, which was run time. I can then say from, and then I have to specify the name of the worksheet that all those columns belong to. Again, in a set of square brackets, sheet 1, and then a $sign to indicate that that's a sheet name. Having done that, we can attempt to open up the record set by saying rs.open. And then a little further down, of course, we'll close the record set. So we'll do that just before we close the connection. So rs.close there. And then again, just to check that this part is going to work, I'd like to write a couple of bits of information into the list box. So I'll change the word connection to the word record set. And I could maybe also print out how many columns I've selected just to check that I've selected the correct number. I can do that by saying listbox1.AddItem, and I'll say rs.fields.count. Okay, so having done that, we can head back to the workbook, click our Show Form button, and it should now say record set opened with the number 3. So all that looks as though it's working correctly at this point. Okay, so we've successfully populated the record set. What we want to do now is get all of the information from it into the list box. And the technique we've just looked at here, the AddItem method, is one way we could do that. We could loop through every single row in the record set and add a new item for each row that we encounter until we reach the end of the record set. But that sounds like quite a lot of effort to me, and there is actually a much easier way. Rather than using the AddItem method to add individual items for a list box, you can use the list property to assign an array of values to the list box. Just to show you the absolute basics of how that might work, I'm just going to take those 2 lines out of my code entirely, and I'm going to say instead listbox1.list equals, then I'm going to use the array function in VBA and say some random old bits of text. It doesn't really matter what. Should we go A, B, C, just because I can't think of anything more inventive than that. So that array function returns an array of values, and that will then be used to populate the list of the list box. So having done that, I can switch back to Excel, click the Show Form button, and I get my array populating that list. So all we need to do now is work out how to return an array of values from the record set that we've just opened. Unfortunately, there's a really easy way to do that. Let's take away the array function and instead replace that with rs.GetRows. So the GetRows method returns an array from the data contained in the record set. There are some optional parameters which allows you to specify how many rows you want to get. If you miss that out, you get all of them, which is what I want. Which row to start at, which if you miss that out, it starts at row number 1, which is what I want. And then a fields list, which if you miss that out, you just get all of the fields from the record set, which again is exactly what I want. So I can just omit all those optional parameters and use the GetRows method. So at this point, if I head back to Excel and then click the Show Form button again, it's kind of partially working at this point. We do get something in the user form, but what we get is not quite what we'd expect. So I've got Jurassic Park, 6/11/93, 126. That's the name, the title, the release date, and the runtime of the first film in the movie's list. The problem with the GetRows method is that it transposes the data from the rows and columns structure in the original source to a column and rows structure in the array. So what we need to do next is something that will transpose that data back into the row and column structure that we wanted from the original data source. And again, fortunately, there's a very easy way to do that. we can use the worksheet function .transpose function. And if we simply pass in an array to the transpose function of the worksheet function object, we'll get, when I head back to Excel and show the form again, we will get a single column at this point, but we get every single film from the list. The next thing we need to deal with is how to show the other two columns of data that we know we've selected. To do that, we simply need to adjust the column count property of the Listbox. And we can either do that manually or we can do it in code. If I close down the user form and head back to the Visual Basic Editor, if I head back to the design view of the form, I can do that very quickly and easily by double-clicking the form object in the Project Explorer. When I have the Listbox selected, you can see that there is a column count property in the Properties window. And I can set that to the value 3 if I know that's always how many columns I'm going to get. But what if we're going to be adjusting our select statement to get different numbers of columns? It probably makes sense to do this dynamically in code. So let's head back to the code view of our form. I can right-click the form and choose View Code. And then, because we're going to be changing a couple of things about the Listbox object, I'm going to begin a with block. So with Listbox 1, and then take the .list property down to the next line. I can then specify how many columns I want my list box to have, so I can add a .column count, and I'm going to make this equal to the number of fields in the record set. So I can say rs.fields.count. I can then close my with block by saying end with, and then if I head back to Excel, click the Show Form button again, we've now got multiple columns of information, one for each field returned by the record set. Next, I'd like to change the column widths of the list box because it doesn't really make sense to give the exact same width to all 3 columns when the film title is so much longer than both the release date and the runtime. So to do that, I'll close down the user form first and then head back to the Visual Basic Editor. And again, we could do this manually in the Properties window in the design of the form, but it makes sense, I think, to do it in code. So I can do that by adding the column widths property to my with block, and then setting that to be equal to a string. And then I can write a semicolon delimited list of column widths. So I'm going to write 300, semicolon, 50, semicolon, 50. Having done that, I can head back to Excel and then click the Show Form button, and this time I'll get a much wider film name column or title column and much narrower film release date and runtime columns. We can also alter the select statement which populates the record set to change the way it's presented to us in the list box. For example, as something simple, let's say we wanted to present the list sorted alphabetically by film name. To do that, I can head back to the Visual Basic Editor, and then we can simply modify the select statement to include an order by clause. It helps here if you know something about how SQL queries work, and again we've got an entire playlist which describes how to write queries, but just for something very simple I'm going to say order by and then the name of the title column, and by default that will go in ascending order. I can optionally indicate that by saying ASC. If I wanted it in descending order I could say DESC instead. But in this case I want it in the default ascending order, so if I head back to Excel and click Show Form, I get my list presented in alphabetical order. We can also add criteria to the select statement to reduce the number of rows returned to the list box. So just as a quick example, let's say we wanted to show only those films that contain the word star somewhere in their name. To do that, we can close down the form, head back to the Visual Basic Editor, and now we need to include a where clause in our select statement. The where clause needs to sit in between the from and the order by. I appreciate this line is getting a little bit long at this point. Maybe it's worthwhile just breaking this across a couple of different lines. Let's use a space underscore character to split that. And then at the end of the from clause, I'll concatenate the next part with a space underscore and then open up some more double quotes. So I'll add my where clause, and I want to ask where the title field is like, and then to write a string of text, I'm going to wrap that in some single quotes. So if I wanted to find films called Star, where their entire name was just the word star, I could write it like so. if I want to find films that contain the word star somewhere in their title, then I need to wrap this up in some wildcard characters. So the wildcard character, which represents any number of characters in SQL, is a percentage symbol. So I'll use a percentage symbol at the beginning of the word star and another one at the end of the word star. And then if I head back to Excel and show the form again, I now get only those films that contain the word star somewhere in their title. So you can see that there's plenty of scope there for manipulating both the select statement, which populates the list box, and properties of the list box itself. But I think at this point that's probably sufficient to answer the original question, how to get the results of the record set out and populate a list box with the record set data. So hope you found that one useful. If you're interested in more to do with list boxes, as I say, there's this extra video which I'll pop a link to in the video description. Hope you found that one useful. Thanks for watching. See you next time.